The Syrian tragedy, a nation divided. Syria, a nation steeped in history, has been ravaged by a brutal civil war that erupted in 2011. At the heart of this conflict lies Bashar al-Assad, a figure who has become synonymous with the turmoil engulfing his country. Assad, who inherited the presidency from his father in 2000, presented himself as a reformer in the early days of his rule. However, his regime's brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters in 2011 ignited a popular uprising that quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war. The Syrian conflict is a multifaceted tragedy, marked by a complex web of internal and external actors. On one side stands Assad's government, backed by powerful allies such as Russia and Iran. On the other side is a fragmented opposition ranging from moderate rebels to extremist groups, each vying for control of the war-torn nation. The conflict has resulted in an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and displacing millions more. Syria's once vibrant cities have been reduced to rubble. Its rich cultural heritage has been decimated by the relentless violence. The Syrian people, caught in the crossfire of a seemingly intractable conflict, have endured unimaginable suffering. As the war enters its second decade, the international community grapples with the question of how to end the bloodshed and bring stability to this shattered nation. The Syrian conflict is a stark reminder of the human cost of political repression, foreign intervention, and the failure to find peaceful solutions to complex crises. It is a tragedy that demands global attention and a concerted effort to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people and chart a course towards a more hopeful future. The case for dictatorship, Assad's iron fist. Bashar al-Assad's rule has been characterized by a consistent pattern of authoritarianism, marked by a brutal crackdown on dissent and a disregard for human rights. His regime's response to the initial protests in 2011, which called for democratic reforms and greater freedoms, was swift and merciless. Security forces opened fire on peaceful demonstrators, imprisoned activists, and silenced any form of opposition. As the uprising gained momentum, Assad's government resorted to increasingly brutal tactics to maintain its grip on power. Reports of torture, extrajudicial killings, and enforced disappearances became widespread. The regime's use of chemical weapons against its own people, most notably in the Ghouta attack of 2013, shocked the world and underscored its utter disregard for international norms. Assad's government has also been accused of deliberately targeting civilians, bombing hospitals and schools, and using siege warfare to starve rebellious populations into submission. The United Nations has documented numerous instances of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Syrian government, leading many to label Assad a war criminal. Critics argue that Assad's actions fit the definition of a dictator, a ruler who exercises absolute power, suppresses all opposition, and governs with little regard for the rule of law or the well-being of his people. They point to his family's decades-long grip on power, his systematic dismantling of any form of dissent, and his brutal response to the Syrian uprising as evidence of his dictatorial tendencies. A complex reality, challenging the dictator narrative. While Assad's authoritarian tendencies and the brutality of his regime are undeniable, some argue that the dictator label is overly simplistic and fails to capture the complexities of the Syrian conflict. They contend that the Syrian uprising was not simply a black and white struggle between a brutal dictator and his oppressed people, but rather a complex civil war with multiple actors and competing agendas. Supporters of this view point to the role of external actors in fueling the conflict, arguing that Assad's government was fighting against foreign-backed insurgents, some of whom held extremist ideologies. They argue that the Syrian government was forced to take tough measures to combat terrorism and preserve the country's territorial integrity. Furthermore, they emphasize the sectarian nature of the conflict, arguing that Assad's Alawite minority government was facing a predominantly Sunni opposition, some of whom harbored sectarian grievances. They argue that Assad's government was defending its community against a potential genocide, pointing to the atrocities committed by extremist groups like ISIS. While acknowledging the human rights abuses committed by the Syrian government, they argue that these actions should be seen in the context of a brutal civil war where all sides have committed atrocities. They contend that the focus should be on finding a political solution to the conflict rather than demonizing one side or the other. This perspective, while acknowledging the authoritarian nature of Assad's regime, urges a more nuanced understanding of the Syrian conflict, recognizing the role of external actors, the sectarian dimension of the war, and the need for a negotiated settlement that addresses the grievances of all parties involved. The world reacts international perspectives on Assad. The international community's response to the Syrian conflict and Bashar al-Assad's role in it has been marked by division, inaction, and geopolitical maneuvering. Western powers, led by the United States, have condemned Assad's government for its human rights abuses and called for his removal from power. They have imposed sanctions on the Syrian regime, provided support to moderate rebel groups, and launched limited military strikes in response to the use of chemical weapons. Russia and Iran, on the other hand, have emerged as Assad's staunchest allies, providing him with diplomatic, military, and financial support. They have vetoed United Nations Security Council resolutions aimed at condemning the Syrian government and have accused Western powers of pursuing regime change in Syria. The Syrian conflict has also exposed the limitations of international institutions, particularly the United Nations, in addressing complex crises. The Security Council's inability to act decisively due to the veto power of its permanent members has hampered efforts to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. The Syrian people have borne the brunt of this international inaction, facing a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Millions have been displaced, both internally and externally, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The conflict has also exacerbated regional tensions, fueling sectarianism and instability in the Middle East. The international community's response to the Syrian crisis has been widely criticized as inadequate and ineffective. Critics argue that the focus on regime change rather than a negotiated settlement has prolonged the conflict and increased human suffering. They call for a more pragmatic approach that prioritizes the protection of civilians, addresses the root causes of the conflict, and seeks a political solution acceptable to all parties involved.